2BC. Welcome back to our journey through Luke's Gospel. Over the last several weeks, we have gone through most of Luke 1. We have looked at the stories of Gabriel's visits with both Zechariah and Mary. And last week, we talked about the birth of John the Baptist, and we got to read Zechariah's prophecy at the end of that chapter. And this week we are going to continue right along as we look at how God continues to fulfill his promises through the coming of Jesus. And so we're going to be in Luke 2 and Luke 3 today. We're only going to be in a little part of Luke 2. We're going to look at the birth of Jesus, and we're also going to look at some of his genealogy listed in Luke 3. And if you are following along in your curriculum books, this lesson is actually listed at the very end, and it is called a Christmas lesson, and it is simply because it is about the birth of Jesus. But it fits where we are in Luke's Gospel, so we're going to pick that up, and then we'll be back on track next week. So look with me here at Luke 2. So we see once again that Luke begins with a timestamp. He's a big fan of letting us know where things are happening in history, what is going on in the world. And so he tells us in the days of Caesar Augustus that there was a decree about a census that should be taken of the entire Roman world. And that this was during the time when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So everyone had to go to their town to register. So Luke gives us this timestamp and sets this in the historical time period of Roman dominion of that entire area. And so people wouldn't have had a choice. They were told they needed to be counted, and so they had to go and return to their ancestral homes. So Joseph takes Mary, and they go from Nazareth up in Galilee down to Judea to Bethlehem. And this would have been around a 70-mile trek. Been hilly. It is not just like a flat plain, nothing like around here in Corpus. And would have been a bit more of a difficult trek, especially walking or riding on a donkey. And they went there to be counted. And we're told they go there specifically, if you look with me at verse 4, because Joseph was part of the house and line of David. And so he goes there with Mary to be registered, to be counted. And so this detail of being part of the line of David is an important one, because the Messiah was supposed to come from the line of David. King David, back in the Old Testament. And if you want to look at his story, you can find it in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And we hear all about King David, and he was a good king, a powerful king. But he had a humble beginning, just like Jesus did. He started out as a shepherd boy. And Samuel, when he went to anoint David as king, wanted to pick any of the other sons of Jesse. And he was like, wait, God kept saying, no, not that one, not that one. So he was going from the oldest down to the youngest and seeing that taller and stronger, all the different things that people would look at. We would maybe consider, that person would be better fit to be king. And he picks David. God says, no, it's this one, this shepherd boy. That's the one. And David then is considered a man after God's own heart. And he is a very strong king and a pretty good king for the people of Israel. And of course, he is not without his flaws. But that is the King David that Jesus is coming in the line of. And God has promised the people that there will be another king, a Messiah, who will rescue them, who will save them. And so the people have been waiting for him, been watching out for this Messiah. And so we see here Luke pointing out this detail that Joseph is of the line of David, and that's why they go to Bethlehem, to David's city, because he's part of that line. And that is where Jesus will be born. And we see Jesus' birth was not your typical birth for a king or a Messiah. He is born and laid in a manger. We're told that there was no guest room available for them, if you look at verse 7. And so they were where the animals were. They were not in the main part of the house. And so whenever Mary gave birth, she wrapped Jesus in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger. So we see here that God comes in the most ordinary way, humblest, most ordinary way. Wrapped in strips of cloth, that would have been a usual way of taking care of a baby, to swaddle the baby in these strips of cloth. But laying him in a manger was not your typical way to take care of a baby. A feeding trough is what that was. That's not really where people lay babies, but that is what she had available. And then we see, if we were to keep reading in Luke 2, and our curriculum stops here at verse 7, but I wanted to point out that another part about Jesus' birth that is so unexpected is that his birth is proclaimed to lowly shepherds. The angels come to the shepherds who are out watching their flocks, and those are the ones who hear the message of this king being born. Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace on those to whom favor rests. And they tell them to go to the city of David because their Savior has been born, the Messiah, the Lord. And the angels give the shepherds two signs. You'll find the baby wrapped in strips of cloth, so these swaddling bands, and lying in a manger, the two signs that the angels give the shepherds. And they go and they find things just as the angels told them, and they are overjoyed. And so these ordinary people go out and they proclaim what God is doing. They're praising God, glorifying him, and telling of all the things they have seen and heard. So Jesus' birth was proclaimed to the shepherds. They go to Bethlehem, as I said, and that is where they see all of these things come true. And here in the city of David, this is once again, it is an important detail. And if we skip ahead to chapter 3, and we look down right after Jesus is baptized, we have a list of names. And a lot of times we can just skim through the list of names, but this is a genealogy. And they don't appear as often in the New Testament as they did in the Old Testament. There's lots of genealogies, especially if you were to look at some of the ones at the beginning of Genesis. But that's what we have here, a genealogy. So-and-so is the son of so-and-so, is the son of so-and-so. And this tells us, when we think about Luke and his gospel, he went out of his way to create this ordered account for Theophilus. And we talked about that in the very first week. And this is part of it, is he is now saying, okay, I've told you the stories about Jesus being born. And then he goes on and he talks about Jesus being circumcised and some interactions there and a story from his childhood. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that. But then here we come to Jesus is baptized, and then he wants to let us know how Jesus fits in to this line of promise. The line of David was the line of promise, the line where the Messiah was to come from. And so Luke goes out of his way to write down this ordered account of Jesus' earthly lineage. And one of the things that is interesting here is this is one of two lineages, genealogies, that we have listed out in the Gospels. The other one is the very first chapter of Matthew. And it's very interesting to compare these two because Matthew begins his with Abraham and moves forward to Jesus, whereas Luke begins with Joseph and works backwards and goes all the way back to Adam. So if you look here, starting in verse 23, it says Joseph, the son of Heli, son of Matthat, son of Levi, and it continues to trace Joseph's lineage backwards. And then you go over here, it says the son of David, the son of Jesse, that's in verse 31, the son of Obed, the son of Boaz, and he traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph all the way back to Adam. If you look here at the very end of chapter 3, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. And so he situates Jesus' birth and establishes that is in this line of God's work. God has already been at work. He's been doing these things all the way back to Adam. God's been at work and preparing the way for the coming of Jesus. So he situates Jesus' birth perfectly here in this lineage. And one of the other things that's interesting about Luke's genealogy is it does seem to highlight more of the unknown people. Matthew's genealogy, there's lots of kings that we would recognize from stories in the Old Testament. But Luke highlights some different people, like a lesser known son of David named Nathan, who is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 3. So there, it still situates him in the correct family line. But regardless, this reminds us that God is at work. He was at work despite the lack of a king for a while. The line was still preserved. Because you remember, people were sent off into exile, and the Davidic monarchy pretty much ended at that point. And there was a lot of confusion about how things were going to be able to go forward, because the king was taken into exile, and how was that going to happen? But God was still at work, and this is a continuation of the story that he was already writing. The story that was already happening in the Old Testament. This is a continuation of that story. That is one of the great things about these genealogies, is they can help us see how God was at work. God in his providence was directing the traffic of history, is a way that I saw it phrased this week. Guiding history to the point when Jesus was born. And one of the other interesting points I thought as I was reading this story this week is, when we look at Jesus' birth and we really read through these early chapters of Luke, we see how many different people were a part of the story who were just ordinary people. I mean, yes, Zechariah was a priest, but he was not the high priest. He was not some special priest. He was just an ordinary priest. And Mary was just an ordinary woman. And Jesus comes in the midst of these ordinary people's lives. And these ordinary people find themselves a part of the story of salvation history, the story of redemption of humanity, these ordinary people. And it's the same thing for these people on this list. They probably, like, you would pick a random name from the list that maybe we don't know. This person probably did not know that they were going to be in the lineage that was going to bring the Messiah, bring Jesus, and all humanity could be saved through him. These random people probably didn't know that. King David probably didn't have a clear idea of what God was saying to him, even, and he got a lot more than some of these other people would have. But they didn't know how God was going to be at work in their life, in the lives of those before them and after them, and how he was bringing things to a point for Jesus to come. But when we look back, and I find this is so true in our lives, at least in my life, is that when I look backwards, sometimes it's easier for me to see the pattern of God's work than it is for me to notice it in the moment. Because the angel visiting Mary and saying, hey, this is happening to you, that's atypical. That's not our norm. We don't normally get God saying, hey, this is what I'm doing, just FYI. It's more, God's at work, and we have to learn how to hear him and see him and recognize that, but we only do that by looking backwards and seeing the pattern of his work in our lives. So I imagine if we could really know something about all of these different people listed in this genealogy. Many of them were just going to be ordinary people, like Mary, like Zechariah, like Elizabeth. But they found themselves in the midst of an extraordinary story. The most extraordinary story. So I know we're a few weeks past Christmas, and so it may seem a little bit unusual to be talking about the quote-unquote Christmas story this week. But I think we can never talk about it too much, because the incarnation, the fact that God, the creator, became one of the created, 100% God, 100% man, that Jesus came, is such a cataclysmic shift for all the rest of everything. God chose to enter human history, to enter time, to break in and be born as a human. And that everything changes as a result. And I love how Luke has set the story up, and other gospel writers do as well, especially thinking of Matthew. And it's a continuation of what God's already been doing. This isn't a new God doing something new. This is God still at work on the pages of history, bringing everything to the fulfillment, to the point where Jesus is going to be born. And that gives us the hope as we look forward that Jesus will return, that God will bring everything to that completion point, and we'll find ourselves in that place where Jesus returns and there is no more sorrow and no more grief and no more death and no more sin, and all of the sad things come untrue. So that is what I take from these two stories today. So I encourage you to read the genealogy. Don't skip over it, but let it remind you instead, even though there's lots of names on this list that we don't know anything about, that God was at work in all of these people's lives, moving so that Jesus could come and he could fulfill his promises. So I hope you will join me again next week as we continue our journey through Luke's gospel, and see you then.